It started with a look. That sharp, careless glance people give when they think they already know you. The morning light poured through the tall museum windows, painting gold across the marble floor. The man in the tailored suit didn't slow down. His phone in hand, his voice sharp with impatience. He brushed past the quiet security guard who stood near the entrance, greeting every guest with calm eyes and a nod that carried years of discipline. But when the man scoffed and muttered, "Some uneducated folks really take these jobs," time seemed to freeze. The guard's face didn't move. His eyes softened instead of hardening. Around them, the world kept moving. School groups chatting, footsteps echoing. Yet, in that stillness, something shifted. A silent lesson waiting to unfold, hidden beneath a uniform and the weight of unseen history. The museum returned to its rhythm. Chatter, footsteps, flashes of camera phones. But somewhere between the hum of conversation and the squeak of shoes, guilt began to crawl through the man's chest. Something about that guard's face stayed in his mind, like an echo he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the calm in his eyes, or the way he didn't fight back. The moment replayed again and again, quieter each time, but heavier. He tried to shake it off, pretending he didn't care, pretending his words were just words. But some truths don't fade. They follow you until you face them. He stopped when something on the wall caught his eye. A face that looked far too familiar. The portrait was large, framed in gold, with a plaque beneath it. The man in the photo wore a military uniform, a medal glinting at his chest, eyes full of courage and peace. Ethan stepped closer, heart thudding. It was the same man, the guard. He felt his throat tighten. Every arrogant word he'd spoken hung in his mind, heavier now than ever. Around him, the room seemed to fade, until only the portrait remained. He saw the medal, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and read the words on the plaque. For courage beyond duty, for saving lives in the face of fire. Ethan stepped back slowly, guilt spilling through his veins like heat. He didn't know what to do. Apologize, hide, or cry. The sound of slow footsteps pulled him back. The guard was there again, walking his route, quiet, unchanged. Ethan turned, searching for words, but none came. Isaiah simply nodded. That same gentle nod from earlier. As if forgiveness didn't need to be spoken aloud. The moment lingered, powerful and wordless. Sometimes the loudest lesson comes from silence. He didn't sleep that night. The museum's silence haunted him. That photograph burned into his thoughts. The man he had mocked was not just a guard. He was history. A living piece of courage he had stepped over without looking down. Ethan scrolled through his phone, searching the museum's archives until he found the same face on a government site. Presidential Medal Recipients, year 2003. The photo showed Isaiah younger, standing beside the president, his hands steady, his smile modest. The caption beneath read, "For saving 12 children during the Fort Sampson bombing." Ethan leaned back, his chest tightening as the words blurred. He realized then, ignorance wasn't just blindness. It was a kind of cruelty. The next morning, he arrived at the museum before opening hours. The air felt heavier, as though it remembered the words he had spoken. He stood by the portrait again, tracing the nameplate with trembling fingers. For the first time, he read every word, slowly, reverently, as if to make up for the haste that once defined him. Isaiah was already there, walking his quiet rounds, and though their eyes met briefly, neither spoke. Ethan wanted to apologize, but his throat refused to move. Sometimes guilt steals language and replaces it with silence. Clara found him standing there, pale, motionless, staring at the wall as if it might forgive him. She had seen it all the day before, though she had stayed silent, knowing truth has its own timing. "You didn't know," she said quietly. He nodded, eyes down. But that's the point, isn't it? Clara told him about Isaiah's service, how he had shielded children from an explosion, how he refused any special treatment afterward, how he chose peace over bitterness. He doesn't talk about it, she added, but the museum does, every day. Ethan felt his knees weaken, not from shock, but from humility. Later that day, Clara walked Ethan through the museum's Heroes Archive, a quiet section where few ever lingered. Each plaque told a story of bravery and sacrifice, but one display stopped them both. It was a photograph of Isaiah's wife, smiling beside her husband, a caption reading, "The Porters, a legacy of faith and courage." Ethan touched the glass gently, his reflection blending with theirs. For the first time, he saw not a security guard, not a name, but a man who carried love through fire. And in that reflection, he saw who he had become, someone who had to change. When he left the museum that evening, the city looked different. Slower, quieter, humbler. Cars passed by, people moved in rhythm, but Ethan felt the stillness of understanding settle inside him. He had mocked a man who had lived for others. The weight of that realization didn't crush him, it transformed him. For the first time, he wasn't running toward success or image. He was walking toward decency. Sometimes one act of arrogance can be the beginning of wisdom, and sometimes the man you look down on is the one holding the mirror you need to face. The following morning, Ethan returned again, not for business or appearance, but for something heavier: repentance. The museum felt different now. Each hall echoed with the quiet breath of stories he once ignored. He walked slower this time, noticing faces, reading plaques, listening to history whisper. His footsteps faltered near the exhibit where Isaiah stood, calm as ever, speaking softly to a group of children about respect. Ethan stayed back, watching him. The same man he'd called uneducated was teaching lessons no book could hold. Each word Isaiah spoke struck Ethan like truth in motion. Gentle, precise, impossible to escape. When the children left, the room fell still. Ethan finally stepped forward, each footstep echoing like a confession. Isaiah turned, his expression calm but unreadable. "I didn't know," Ethan said quietly, voice trembling. "I judged you before I even saw you." Isaiah studied him. Not angry, not smug, just still. "That's how most of the world works," he replied, voice deep and even. "They look first, think last." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to hold his gaze for long. He had faced many boardrooms and deals, but never a moment that made him feel this small. And yet, this free. Isaiah didn't rush to answer. He just looked at Ethan with the patience of a man who's seen storms come and go. "You can't change what you said," Isaiah finally murmured, "but you can decide what you'll see next time." The words hit deeper than any accusation. Ethan nodded, tears stinging behind his eyes. He wanted to say more, to explain himself, but Isaiah raised a hand gently. A signal of peace, not rejection. "Respect," Isaiah continued, "'tisn't given to those who ask for it. It's given to those who live it." Ethan bowed his head, the weight of that truth pressing into his soul. Clara entered the room just as the two men stood in silence. She didn't speak, but her eyes held quiet pride. She had seen this moment coming, the intersection of pain and grace. Isaiah turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, then back to Ethan. "People think medals are made of metal," Isaiah said softly, glancing toward his old photograph. "They're made of moments like this." Ethan's lips parted, no words forming. For once, silence was enough, because silence here was respect. As the museum closed, Isaiah walked Ethan to the exit. The hall stretched before them, long and empty, the echoes of the day fading into quiet grace. "We all learn," Isaiah said softly, "but some lessons come with a scar." Ethan nodded, a faint smile trembling at the edges of his lips. When he reached the door, he turned back, looking at the man in uniform one last time. The man who had every reason to hate, yet chose to forgive. And for the first time in his adult life, Ethan understood what greatness truly looked like. The next day, rain fell over the city like quiet penance. Ethan stood outside the museum, holding an umbrella, watching drops roll down the glass walls. He had written a letter the night before. Short, honest, raw. But now the paper in his hand felt heavier than words should. When Isaiah arrived for his shift, dressed in his usual pressed navy uniform, their eyes met through the drizzle. No words yet, just acknowledgement. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, the kind that forgave before it spoke. Ethan took a deep breath, knowing that this time his voice had to come from the heart, not the habit. When Ethan finally spoke, the words came out trembling. "I'm sorry," he said simply, his voice low but steady. "I saw your picture. I read what you did. I don't have an excuse. I didn't see you." Isaiah listened without interruption, his expression calm, unreadable, yet kind. When Ethan offered the folded letter, Isaiah took it without hesitation, slipping it into his pocket before nodding once. "Seeing," Isaiah said quietly, "takes more than eyes." His tone wasn't scolding. It was forgiving, a truth delivered softly enough to heal but firmly enough to stay. Inside the lobby, Isaiah opened the letter later when the morning rush had faded. The words were shaky, imperfect, but sincere. Ethan had written not only an apology but a promise to remember, to respect, to teach others the same lesson. Isaiah folded the letter again and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't need grand speeches or tears. He needed honesty, and that finally he had been given. He looked up at the hall of portraits and smiled faintly, as if whispering to the faces around him, maybe they still learn. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned, not to apologize again, but to help. He stood by Clara as volunteers prepared for a veterans exhibit, carrying boxes, setting up banners. He didn't seek attention or recognition. He simply worked. Isaiah watched from across the room, saying nothing. There was something healing in seeing the same man who once dismissed him now serving with humility. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives in the quiet labor of changed hands. When the event began, the museum filled with veterans, families, and students. Isaiah stood near the entrance, shaking hands, smiling softly, his presence a symbol of living history. Ethan approached once more, not to speak, but to stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Together, they greeted guests. Two men from different worlds sharing one lesson. That respect isn't born from background, but from humanity. And in that small, silent partnership, forgiveness found its full form. Days turned into weeks, and the museum grew busier with visitors drawn by the new veterans exhibit. Yet for Ethan, the real exhibit wasn't behind glass. It was the man standing quietly by the door each morning, offering greetings with the same steady calm. He came often now, not out of guilt, but gratitude. Every time he passed Isaiah, their nods carried a silent acknowledgement of what had changed. He had once looked at the world through the narrow lens of pride. Now he saw people, stories, weight, and worth. Change didn't come in a single apology. It came in every moment after, where humility learned to breathe. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by Clara's office to thank her. She was sorting through old museum files when he handed her a small donation envelope marked for the hero's archive. "It's not much," he said, "but it's something." Clara looked up, smiling softly. "He doesn't want credit," she said, "just understanding." Ethan nodded, knowing she was right. He wasn't trying to repay anything. He just wanted to be part of something honest. As he left, Clara watched him go, quietly proud that sometimes even arrogance can turn into empathy, given time and truth. That evening, as the museum emptied, Isaiah took a slow walk through the halls. He stopped by his own photograph, the one of him in uniform, younger, standing beside the president. The gold frame had been polished recently, though he never asked who did it. Standing before it, he saw not pride, but peace. Every medal, every scar, every word left unsaid had led him here. To a quiet job where he could guard not just history, but humanity. He smiled faintly, not for the honor, but for the lesson still alive in others. Outside, the evening was painted in gold. Ethan waited near the steps, hands in his pockets, gazing at the flags waving above the museum. When Isaiah stepped out, they exchanged a small smile. No words, no ceremony, just recognition. The sky burned with the color of closure, soft orange fading into blue. Two men, once strangers divided by judgment, now stood side by side, their silence saying everything words couldn't. Forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was a bridge they had both built quietly, brick by humble brick. Months later, the museum unveiled a new section, Everyday Heroes. It featured photographs of people who served quietly. Janitors, nurses, teachers, guards, those whose names rarely made history books. In the center hung Isaiah's portrait, newly framed with his story written beneath in simple words. Ethan stood among the crowd, reading it with his hand over his heart. Isaiah didn't notice him at first, busy greeting guests, but when their eyes met across the room, both men smiled. A final acknowledgement that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the highest form of strength. Months passed, and the story of the security guard and the businessman began to ripple quietly through the museum's visitors. Teachers used it as a story of character. Parents whispered it to children walking past Isaiah's picture. Yet for Isaiah and Ethan, it wasn't a tale. It was real life. A simple truth learned the hard way. Isaiah carried on his duties, never boasting, never reminding anyone of what happened. Ethan continued to visit, now volunteering on weekends. The world hadn't changed overnight, but two men had. And sometimes that's where change truly begins, in the quiet space between regret and redemption. One afternoon, a reporter came to write about the museum's Everyday Heroes exhibit. She noticed Isaiah's portrait and asked for a short interview. Isaiah hesitated, then agreed, only if she promised to write about everyone else too. "I'm no different," he said, his voice steady. "I just did what needed doing." The reporter smiled and nodded, moved by his simplicity. Ethan watched from afar, proud but silent. The guard he once insulted was now teaching the world what true education looked like: compassion. Later that week, Ethan brought his father to the museum. An older man whose beliefs had shaped his own. They walked together through the hall of portraits, stopping in front of Isaiah's image. Ethan said nothing at first, letting the silence speak. His father frowned, confused, until he read the plaque. Then, slowly, he looked up, seeing Isaiah himself walking across the hall. The old man removed his hat out of respect. That simple gesture, quiet and sincere, broke a chain longer than pride could measure. Sometimes one generation learns only when another chooses to change. As weeks turned to months, Ethan and Isaiah's quiet friendship grew. They rarely talked about the past. They didn't need to. Their conversations now were about life, family, and the small things. The weather, the kids' laughter in the museum halls, the sound of history breathing in every corner. For Isaiah, forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing himself from the weight of bitterness. For Ethan, redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about living in a way that honored the lesson he had learned. By the time the first anniversary of the exhibit arrived, Ethan had helped fund a scholarship for veterans returning to education. He named it the Porter Grant, not out of charity, but when he presented it quietly to the museum board, Isaiah shook his head, smiling. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Ethan replied. "I did, because you taught me what educated really means." They stood in silence, the crowd applauding softly in the background. Two men who began as opposites now stood as equals, teacher and student, united by respect, by humanity, by grace. A year later, the museum had changed in small but meaningful ways. Visitors lingered longer in front of the Everyday Heroes exhibit, whispering quietly as they read each plaque. Teachers led students to Isaiah's portrait, asking them what it meant to be truly educated. And somewhere among the crowd, Ethan stood, smiling humbly. No longer a man haunted by his mistake, but inspired by what it taught him. Isaiah still worked his shifts, calm and steady, greeting everyone with the same warmth. It wasn't fame he carried, it was purpose. And in that quiet purpose, he became the kind of teacher no classroom could produce. That evening, Isaiah walked through the quiet halls after closing. The lights dimmed, and the air hummed with stillness. He passed by each portrait, soldiers, doctors, teachers, janitors, nodding as though greeting old friends. When he reached his own picture, he paused for a long moment. The photo no longer reminded him of war or medals. It reminded him of peace, of second chances, of grace that echoed far beyond words. Behind him, Ethan appeared with 2 cups of coffee, handing one silently. Together, they stood before the portrait, not as guard and visitor, but as 2 souls humbled by life's simple truth. Respect is the foundation of every story worth remembering. Not long after, Isaiah was invited to speak at a local school. He hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his comfort, but Ethan encouraged him. "Kids need to hear you," he said. And so he went, standing before a room of young faces who looked up with awe. He didn't talk about medals or battles. He talked about dignity, about seeing people as they are, not as they appear. When he finished, the room was silent, not out of confusion, but respect. In that silence, he saw the future, a generation that might just get it right. As years went by, the scholarship grew, helping veterans across the country rebuild their lives. Isaiah never sought credit, though his name appeared on every certificate. He simply continued showing up. Every day, every morning, a quiet symbol of endurance and empathy. Ethan often joined him, helping where needed, both men now known for their kindness rather than their titles. What began as an insult had become an institution of understanding. Sometimes, the smallest spark of ignorance can, when met with grace, ignite a lifetime of wisdom. On his final day before retirement, Isaiah took one last slow walk through the museum. Every wall, every name, every memory felt like family. At the front desk, Ethan waited, holding a framed photograph, the 2 of them standing side by side beneath Isaiah's portrait. "For you," Ethan said softly. Isaiah smiled, eyes glistening. "You learned well," he replied. As he walked out the doors, the sunlight embraced him, warm and forgiving. Some stories end quietly, not with applause, but with peace. His did, because the lesson he lived had already become immortal.